Another very important term that we talk about is called elasticity. What is elasticity? When is something elastic?
Ability to be stretched out, compact.
Absolutely. So an elastic object is an object that is okay with a change in deformation. So the more elastic something is, it is more able to come back from being deformed. Make sense? So for example, if I take this pen and I break it, what will happen?
You're going to cry.
Well, yeah, I'm going to cry because it's really expensive, but beyond that, it won't be able to be fixable, and that's why I'm going to cry. But if I had an elastic band and I stretched it, I could stretch it a lot and it'll still come back to its original, right? So elasticity is that property of a solid which allows it to come back to its original state after it has been deformed. Good? So let's now look at the proper definition of this. Elasticity is a property of an object that allows it to be restored to its original shape after deformation. Can you think of an example?
Spring.
A spring. A spring is a very good example. So if you have a mass attached to a spring, what happens to it if you take the mass off? It goes back to its original, right? Or a rubber band, or those, yeah, what are they called? Hair ties, right? They are elastic. They allow them to be, when you take them off and put them on the table, they go back to their original shape, no matter how much you've stretched them. However, there is always a certain limit, which is called the elastic limit, after which any material can be broken, right? It's called the elastic limit.
That are elastic or not elastic will break.
The point at which objects will no longer go back to original state. So there are two things that can happen. We could either deform them or we could break them, right? You could deform the thing or you could actually break it apart.
Which is another way of saying deforming it.
So for example, if you take your hair tie example, right? It only lasts a certain time, after which will it go back to its original shape? It will be deformed. But then if you keep using it, eventually at one point they will actually physically break. And that's when we will call it the break limit. Yes.
Also, just it's easier for me to remember, and I don't know if it's helping me, like muscles when they like stretch out, and then if they tear, it's like you can't. Because then they won't be the same. They'll have like
Yeah.
stuff.
I just went through surgery because they broke. Yes.
I was going to say bones.
Bones too, but bones are rigid.
Yeah.
So yes, let's talk about that. So
They,
muscles are elastic, bones are rigid.
yes.
So they could be elastic or they could be rigid. So we call it the rigidity of the material, right? And so rigidity means that they're strong enough to hold for a long time before they actually break. And that's called rigidity. Good point. I should define that too. Rigidity.
Yeah.
Rigidity. Did I spell that right? That's a good point. So bones are rigid. It takes a lot of effort to break them. But once you break them, they are deformed. And they will never, well, you can try to put them back together, but they're never really back to their original shape, right?
Yeah.
They always have some calcium deposit, something else happens to them. They're not never back to their original state. So you have deformed them, but you can fix it. And that's called the rigidity of real bodies, for example.
Versus fake bodies?
Well, let me define what a real body is. Any object, no matter how elastic or no matter how rigid, all rigid objects have some elasticity to them. And all elastic objects have rigidity to them. Does that make sense? So nothing is a perfect rigid or a perfectly elastic object. So for example, if I press down on this wood, there's still a little bit of give in it, right? Because everything is basically made up of molecules. So molecules will indeed compress. Now, will they compress a lot or will they compress a little? But every single object is a combination of both. Does that make sense? More elastic objects, less force is required to move them. More rigid objects, more force is required to move them. But they're both a combination of both things.